Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and just to let you know, if you're watching this on Tuesday evening in our regular time slot, we are taping this show ahead of time because right now, Tuesday at 7, there's a fantastic program going on at Mount Moriah Church on Moore Avenue in New London. New London Landmarks has a program on urban renewal and housing fairness. It's in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, which really changed the face of New London, and not really necessarily in a positive way. So that event, if you're watching this, will also be videotaped, and we'll let people know when you can view that. So back to tonight's show. In 2018, in the even years, are the statewide elections. There's been a certain amount of press on gubernatorial races, congressional races, state rep, state senate races. And so one of the things that this show's going to be trying to do over the next few months is to get a green view on issues that affect our town, our region, and our state. So my guest tonight is Eugene Woloszyn. He's a Green from Coventry, Connecticut. He's exploring the possibility of running for Congress in the 2nd District. And we're going to talk to Eugene about his background, his interests, and what the Green Party brings to these views. So welcome, Eugene.
Thank you.
I guess first thing I wanted to do, because you're not well known as a political person in the region, is what's your background and how did you get interested in politics?
My parents were working class. My dad and mom worked in a shoe factory in upstate New York in a small town called Johnson City. And next door was Endicott, New York, which was the future home of IBM. And that's where IBM was founded. But Johnson City was a shoe town and it had very paternal ownership, the Johnson family, and unions were kept out. Wages were relatively low, a lot of immigrant workers. My parents were from Poland and came to that area and got jobs there. My dad became a machinist, and he tried to form a union a couple of times, was unsuccessful. And so growing up, I saw the power of big corporations and how they affect families positively and negatively. And I saw how unions were kept out, and every May Day, which is a traditional socialist left holiday, the Johnsons would return from their Florida vacations, and there would be floats and celebrations for the man who brought prosperity to our community. And so that was a reversal of worker solidarity into support for the richest man in town. And the corporation did very well up until the 50s and 60s when imports came in. And in that situation, the workers lost their jobs. They lost the benefits, which were assumed to be lifetime, and things went downhill, and the corporation practically doesn't exist anymore. But that was also true of the IBMers, who, when I was growing up, were the most prestigious and money-wise were the best paid, and they had country clubs for the workers and everything. But that was dissolved also in the process of IBM going into crisis at a certain point, moving out, and workers were left just like my parents' previous generation. So it's a process of transformation of corporations. The people that own it remain, and their families are very successful, but the workers do not turn out that well.
And it reminds me, as you're saying this, that part of the problem, I think, you had the old company towns, and then we had the big corporate towns. And I think it's a problem that happens everywhere where the economy is dependent on one industry or one or two industries. And in some ways, we don't have the old model of factory town anymore, but a lot of our towns kind of look like factory towns in terms of being dependent on just one or two big employers to create prosperity.
Exactly. And upstate New York has been devastated by the flight of industry, and some of the big cities are still prosperous, but for the smaller towns, they've been very hard hit.
And I think we could say probably the same about Connecticut, other than a few cities that are doing very well. You know, I'm sure Stamford is doing well, but but Hartford, Norwalk, Waterbury, you know, all of New London County, really, and probably it's the same in Windham County and up in Tolland County. There's a struggle. Now you worked for the U.S. Postal Service for many years. So you went from growing up in a company town that was anti-union to being a union member. Was that intentional, and how did that change you?
There's a process, and the process was being good in math and physics and going to the local university. And at that point, I could go to college. Even though my parents had very little money, I could go to college on a state scholarship, live at home, you know, pay for my books and so forth for nothing. And so I went to college for 4 years, graduated in physics, and then went on to Syracuse University thinking I was going to be a physicist or theoretical physicist or an atomic physicist or something. And while at Syracuse University, the anti-war movement hit me very, very hard. And in the process, I became an activist and wanted to end that war, wanted to end wars in general. And so it changed my life. It moved me away from physics, which I didn't see as the future for myself personally, but also for the nation in terms of atomic war and other things.
That's probably where the jobs in physics were going in the 60s, was towards weapons development.
Right, exactly. And I became a factory organizer for a while. I changed my career and life goals, and then began to work in small job shops, some to try to unionize an envelope, to move the union further in terms of an envelope factory I worked for 3 years, and in other ways, but the future was dim because there were small job shops, some for the defense industry. One place I worked 14 hours a day for a 4-day week and drove cabs on the weekend to try to save money to buy our first home, my wife and I. But the situation was that I had no future for a pension. And then that was the goal, to try to figure out something. And therefore I applied in 3 different cities to get into the post office. It was a 5-year period, but eventually I got in. But the Postal Service, I liked the job. I liked meeting the people, 27 years, most of it in Hartford in the inner city. I loved the customers. I loved the young kids, played basketball with them, you know, on my lunch hour and so forth. And that was fulfilling. I felt I was doing a socially good job. The job needed to be done.
Now, did people tell you, relatives tell you you were wasting your brains or something?
Not so much. People realized that I was pretty serious about what I was doing and that I wasn't going to change. And that I was able to make a livelihood for myself and my family. But the Postal Service, during my 27 years, I really saw the change in productivity, in stress, and in push. And I think it's happening in most other industries. The intensity of how we work. You know, it was John Maynard Keynes, a very famous economist, said that by approximately 1970 or so, he figured there's going to be a 30-hour work week. You know, that we would or even 25 hours. We won't have to work this number of hours because manufacturing and capitalism is so productive that there should be no little stress, much more recreation. And it hasn't worked out that way.
No, it's almost been the opposite.
Yes.
You know, I worked in early childhood education, which was also very fulfilling, but has actually been very resistant to unionizing. I participated in a couple of failed unionizing attempts, and just the little things that, I mean, making people, in some places, having you punch a time clock, and if you get there at 2 minutes after your shift starts, you know, getting docked 2 minutes of pay, even if you stayed over 10 minutes on the other end. And it was just the whole expectation was kind of a dehumanizing sense.
Yes. And it's the being written up for insubordination, for breaking of minor rules, and the pressure that puts you under. You know, that the rule that you may be given 3 months of probation or something, and all the stresses, and you're forced to carry all these electronic devices to indicate that packages have been delivered, and you know, they monitor you in terms of every minute, in terms of your walking route. They want to know where you are. You have to scan certain barcodes at individual places, but all these things add up.
So really, they know, even in a union position, you are tracked every minute of your day.
Yeah. And that's true of UPS and FedEx and, you know, all of these things. And they are, and the intensity, and there will be failed policies, you know, policies that don't work, but they'll be in existence for 1, 2, 3 years, and then they'll finally be eliminated. But they'll never say, we were in error on this, or, you know, this wasn't necessary. And they will have churned up a tremendous amount of work time that's not productive, but that follow the intensity of what they're hoping to achieve. That is more and more productivity.
Fewer and fewer employees.
Exactly.
So you retired a few years ago.
Yes, about 3 years ago.
And I know you became involved in Eastern Connecticut Green Action, and we have a lot of friends up in the northeast corner who are involved in that. Can you talk a little bit about what that group's been doing?
Yes, they have very good attendance, about 15 or 20 people each month. They put out a newsletter, in effect, with about 5 articles each month, which are very educational, most of which I wasn't aware of, on electricity, on solar, that's group solar and so forth, and banning the question of fracking, banning fracking and so forth. So that they are an active, serious group, and I'm very impressed by them. And their focus is legislative as well as local town activities.
Now, did they get involved with a fracking waste ban? Or I know the Food and Water Watch was one of the organizations, but I was wondering
Yes, they make regular reports on how things are progressing, and Doug Larry of the Green Party has attended some of their meetings and reports on what he is doing, and they coordinate activities.
So, as a person who's gotten into electoral politics, let's say fairly recently, what would you say is the biggest issue that our region faces that we need to bring new ideas to?
Well, I think one of them is, and it's difficult to have a solution, but let me just say it's the military budget. In a town like mine, Coventry, it's $195 million that has gone from taxpayers in Coventry to the federal government and then spent in the military.
Wait, can you repeat that number?
Yes, $195 million. And this is a small town of Coventry. And if you compare Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, it's about $1 billion. Each one of those towns has given up since 2001, when Bush II wars started in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the cumulative cost of all that. And it's not just the numbers that they talk about currently, 700 billion to the Pentagon, and next year it's going to go up another 85 billion to 785 billion. But there are all these other agencies that revolve around the Pentagon. That is CIA, the NSA, Homeland Security, Border Patrol, FBI, et cetera, et cetera. All these churn a tremendous amount of tax dollars, and they have private contractors, which have been the big development since 2001. And so much of that money ends up in contractors around the DC area, and that's why DC is the highest income area, one of the reasons, in the highest income area in the country.
And then we end up with the situation, of course, that's been in the news more since Citizens United, that those private contractors in turn have plenty of money they can use to help influence policy.
Exactly. And the Pentagon tries to have a defense corporation in practically every congressional district. And it's either a main contractor or a subcontractor. And that whole process is true in eastern Connecticut, obviously, with Electric Boat. And so a congressperson like Joe Courtney will obviously support or make sure that that's one of his big emphasis. And therefore, if he has his other congresspeople are going to support him on this operation, then he has to support their districts and their defense plants. And it's a system of lobbyist gifts and payments to politicians. Joe Courtney has to raise $10,000 a week. And that's what the new congressmen come in, they're told, look, this is, you got to spend 20 hours or 10 hours, 15 hours a week on the phone, calling lobbyists, calling rich people and so forth to make, Joe his campaign is going to be costing $1 to $1.2 million, and he's got to raise that money all the time.
It seems so odd to me that he does, though, because, I've been very proud of the Green Party candidates we've run over the last 10 years. But on the other hand, since Joe Courtney ousted Rob Simmons a decade ago, the Republicans really have never put up anyone who was real competition for Joe Courtney. So you'd think that even if he spent almost nothing, he'd get reelected. So part of me just can't even figure out how we got here.
Yes, and they're all going through the motions. They're like blind men going over a cliff, and nobody is evaluating, do we need these projects? The Homeland Security projected from 2010 to 2020 to go from 300 billion to 600 billion. And it's the President Obama, who got the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, and yet he's the man that proposes modernizing the nuclear weapons of the United States for $1.2 trillion over a 30-year period. I mean, these are insane projects, and just this weekend, I subscribed to something from Politico, and that is their new newsletter on space war. And then who is going to put out this newsletter? Well, it's funded by Boeing. And they, this plan is already $12.5 billion that they've invested in the space. And Trump says he wants to be able to fight to be totally dominant in space, and if necessary, to fight a war in space, et cetera.
Boy, it kind of brings back the Reagan years of this old Star Wars gambit, which never really went anywhere, but I think a lot of money was spent nonetheless.
It's still being spent. There's about $10 billion each year is spent on that program since the mid-1980s. And even the Pentagon wanted to cut it back and so forth. But these districts that have these contracts, the Congress people fight to preserve them. And so once it gains momentum, it's very difficult to stop.
And I think that the issue is even, we seem to lack imagination. Even during the 1980s, our region here, electric boat was huge during most of the Reagan years. And then it was reduced in size by over half. And that caused a huge local economic depression. People lost their houses lost value. And at that time, even relatively conservative representatives were thinking, oh, we have to diversify because we put ourselves at such risk if we're just dependent on the EB and the military money. But it seems as though no one is saying that anymore, or not many people are saying that anymore. It's more like we have to keep this going because it's equivalent to economic development. Maybe not everywhere in Connecticut, but certainly in the eastern region, that's the second district.
Right. And Congressman Courtney is very proud in his newsletter that I received in telling us that the Courtney Amendment makes sure that there are 3 attack subs being built per year, while a while back there was only 1 attack sub. So you have these attack subs, and you have over 50 of them already, and you're going to be building 3 each year. And do you really need them? Are they a dinosaur? Are they really World War II weapons that there's going to be a big transformation, that the next war isn't going to be fought like that? And that was in a recent, I watched on C-SPAN, a recent hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And Kissinger was there, and one of Reagan's former Secretary of State. And this man, whose name escapes me right now, but the Secretary of State, former Secretary of State, said, in the next war, if it's with China, there is a transformation coming about where cruise missiles are going to be used against aircraft carriers. And not only cruise missiles, but drones, and literally hundreds and thousands of small drones. And the small drones are going to have explosive power that are based on nanotechnology to create a very powerful blast from a very small munition. And these are the kind of attacks we might face. But the United States has 11 aircraft carrier task forces, each with 14 large ships in it, and they prowl the world. And the question really is, are you and I benefiting from this situation? You know, do we own the oil wells?
And is our national security actually benefiting from it, not just you and me?
Right.
So we're spending this money. It is keeping the economy going in many of our communities, but it's not really creating something that's helpful towards our future. So what do you see as things we can be spending money on that would provide an economic boost, but would also provide us with a better future?
Yeah, I believe that the existing workers in the defense industry need to be protected in terms of if there are declines in the military budget, that there are guarantees as to their retraining and possibly supplements to their income if other jobs they get were not sufficiently paid, etc. But I think green jobs and the movement towards alternative energy and the wind power that could be in Long Island Sound, and New London can be the stepping off point for such wind power. The development of clustered solar. On my way here on Route 32, there's a wonderful clustered solar project. I don't know who sponsored it, but it is in a field next to Route 32. But these are the kind of projects that could be carried out that would lessen the possibility of climate change efforts, effects, and that unless we do something boldly, and what was done boldly in World War II is within 2 months, all civilian production of cars and trucks was ended, and everything went on a military footing. There can be, if there was the will, and unfortunately it's probably going to take disasters to force people to realize it, but that there can be a transformation of the United States. We have done it in the past, and we can do it in the future. And that would enable defense workers to move into other analogous industries, such as high-speed rail or wind mills, etc.
And we know already our infrastructure is not in good shape. Our transit is not really where it should be. And I guess a bit of the good news is these offshore wind farms, people are really working on them in a very concrete way. And we hope to have a show in the future on the planned farm, 60 miles out with New London as a potential hub, which would be a great development for our city, which really doesn't have a lot of high-paying jobs outside of the defense industry right now. I guess, what else do we want to talk about? Let's talk a little bit about education. And I guess we can talk about the bad news and the good news. So you had mentioned that when you went to college, it was fairly inexpensive. And I remember I was at a private university in the 60s, and even those were relatively affordable compared to now. I think tuition at top universities in the 60s might have been $2,500 a year. And although wages were, of course, much lower, families, with household incomes of $20,000, $30,000 didn't even necessarily need financial aid. So now it's like, I don't know, student debt is ridiculous. It's just hampering a whole generation. And if the millennials hate us boomers, I kind of can't blame them. We haven't exactly, made a very friendly world for them as they go out and think about trying to get a good job or purchase a house or be able to afford health care. But what about education? There's been a lot of talk about public education, both in terms of Betsy DeVos and even like under Obama. I wouldn't say that Arne Duncan was really a friend of public education any more than Betsy DeVos is. But what do you see that we can do, or our Congress people can do, to promote public education? And what do you think is happening that's good in spite of the bad stuff happening in Washington?
I think in the high school level, there has to be an emphasis on trade schools, so that there is a path for young people that aren't going to college. And in Switzerland, for instance, and in Germany, there are 39 apprenticeships that are offered to high school students. And they can go, say, 2 days a week to go to a factory, manufacturing or some other kind, welding, whatever, and learn a trade, begin to learn a trade to get a taste of it, whether they like it. And maybe they don't like it. Maybe then they would think of college. But there has to be, career paths set up. And they talk about the gig economy and that people have to be retrained all the time. Well, they have to set up a structure, whether in the community colleges or in other places, to do this retraining. And to me, it starts at the high school or even junior high school level, where people really get an experience of what jobs are like and the intensity of them, and the fact you don't have a union and what that means. So that, to me, that's one component. And the other one is that states have completely cut back the amount of money they're giving to universities. and for scholarships. And therefore, the costs have skyrocketed at the public schools and obviously at the others. But there should be free public tuition and fees at the state universities and the community colleges. And the only place you can get that money, because states are so strapped for cash, just looking at Connecticut and obviously Oklahoma and West Virginia and other places, that there has to be new funding means. And part of that is the old funding means from the 60s going, the Title I, Title II acts and so forth. But the defense budget is eating that money. So that money can never get to the states and get to the localities. And the taxation that's necessary to get that money is gone because of the Trump tax bill and so forth. You cut the business taxes from 35% to 21%. And what it does is it's a bonanza for business, and they don't even pay 21%. They're going to pay 12. Some of them will pay 9%, or people like Trump will pay nothing because they have the tax gimmicks and the write-offs in the hotels and so forth.
And Connecticut has been in a bad situation in terms of the balance of payments with the federal government for a long time. The amount of federal taxes that our state pays in through individuals and businesses paying federal taxes, we get a very poor return back from, for each dollar. I think Connecticut and New Jersey usually have about the worst balance of any state in the union. And it's sort of ironic that we New England states, Eastern Seaboard states, are always denigrated as being, the welfare states. But actually, for the most part, for the last 30 years at least, we have been subsidizing the rest of the country, which, if it were for good purposes, I would not begrudge. But it isn't necessarily for good purposes. Let's talk a little bit about healthcare, because before we leave education, before we went on the air, you were talking a little bit about some positive developments with some people starting to find their power. Yes. So talk a little about that.
Very exciting in West Virginia and what spontaneously has occurred. To be on strike for 9 days in the face, in most states, like in Connecticut, if you tried that, because the state recognizes collective bargaining, immediately there would be injunctions because there's rules in the contracts to prevent that. But these southern states have never allowed collective bargaining. So the workers are doing what workers did in the 30s and 40s, and they are taking power into their own hands and flipping the power arrangements. And the governor James Justice, his name is, the governor of West Virginia, he called the teachers dumb bunnies. And that was one of the things that
sounds like fighting words.
And he's a coal baron, okay? This guy is a billionaire. He owns the Greenbrier Resorts in West Virginia, which are this huge complex. And the Greenbrier Resorts is where Congress people and the cabinet go if there's a nuclear war. And there are tunnels and chambers under the Greenbrier where they can go and hide. They might have to hide for 10,000 years or something until it.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like much of a life to me, but.
But it's their temporary escape. But James Justice, they have a 5% tax on oil and natural gas and coal that's pulled out of the ground, and it should be much higher, but he won't even consider that. And so that they're doing all these gimmicks to come up with the money. The workers stayed out, and they didn't. Frequently what happens is there is a tentative agreement, and then the workers go back to work, and then it may not be approved. And it wasn't approved because they refused. They said, we're only going to give you, they agreed to 5%, and then they said that we're only going to give you 4%. And the workers were fortunately still out, and they forced the 5%, and then the state government said, well, we're going to apply this to all the workers in the state. But then the later thing that's being discussed now is where they come up with the money. And one way they may come up with some of the money is to eliminate Medicare or lower the amount of, Medicaid that's available in the state. And that's the thing that funds the opioid addiction treatments and so forth.
And yeah, lots of health care backup for, well, you know, that's a frustration to me. We do sometimes feel like we're in a situation where we're fighting over crumbs, like we normal people. So healthcare dollars are being pitted against, education dollars are being pitted against, you know, just worker, you know, student loan dollars, whatever. So we end up, you know, and the big money is really somewhere else.
Right. I'd like to just mention,
Sure.
This is a book. It's by Piketty, who was a guy trained at Harvard, and he's a French economist. And the title of the book is Why Save the Bankers? But there was
Iceland didn't.
You're right.
And they did okay.
Yes, and they got out of their crisis and let the banks fail. A very good example. And they reconstituted the banks, you know, with new leadership, et cetera, and it's surviving. But he uses one example, and that is that the wealth of the United States is approximately $70 trillion. And if you divide 330 million people into that $70 trillion, you come up with $250,000 per person is what the wealth of the U.S. is. And if you have a family of 4, you would have $1 million as the wealth of that family. But if you compare that 1 million to what people's actual wealth is, and there's 30 or 40% that have no wealth at all,
yeah, or negative even.
Or negative wealth, exactly, with their indebtedness, then that means that the tremendous amount of billionaires are the ones that make that average of $1 million. But that helped me to understand the inequality. You know, the inequality that comes from things like the Sackler family from Connecticut that owns Purdue Pharma, that created OxyContin and pushed OxyContin for 15 years. You know, they now give billions to arts, I should say millions, not billions, to arts organizations, Metropolitan Museum of Art, et cetera. They're honored philanthropists and so forth, but they made their money on entrapping people because of work injuries or kids. My grandson is one of them. You know, hooked on OxyContin, now into heroin and other things, and his life is ruined. And, you know, he's in the process of out of jail. But those are the people. Those ruling class people and the decisions they make are equivalent to the smoking and other crimes that were committed and denied for decades.
So maybe things are going to catch up with them sooner or later.
I would like to see that very much, and I work for that goal.
And I guess before we start talking about upcoming events, you know, you brought this up, so I wanted to bring up drug policy. I think that is one area that the Green Party has been ahead of the curve for a long time in terms of having, you know, promoting an approach of harm reduction, you know, for over a decade, which we're just now seeing in the general public. So what would you like to see on a federal level and a state level as well on how we change our drug policy?
Right. I think people have to go to jail that started the opioid crisis. The company itself paid $500 million in a settlement around 2006. They charged it off as a business expense. No executive went to jail. No Sackler family went to jail. You know, it's just business as usual. It's a cost of production. It's a cost of carrying out. It's a calculated economic thing. Well, yeah, this is maybe a risky strategy, a business model, but we'll get out of it. You know, we have good legal talent, et cetera. I think there has, you know, the whole financial crisis, 2008 on, no executives went to jail. No executives were indicted. There's a wonderful PBS documentary, an hour long, in which they described the only people that were kind of brought up on charges was a Chinese American bank in New York City that they blamed for housing irregularities. And the family that owned the bank had to struggle for 3 years to finally were vindicated. But it shows the discussions and the pressure they were under all during this time period. And Cyrus Vance Jr., the son of the Democratic former Secretary of Defense in the 1960s.
Yeah, he was in the Carter administration as well, I believe.
And he is the district attorney of Brooklyn, and he's the one that persecuted this thing. Never took on Wall Street, but persecuted this, and he's defending himself. Well, we have to go after all criminals, et cetera, et cetera. But it's to me, justice. The hands of justice are not equal for rich people and poor people, and that becomes more obvious all the time.
No, and our drug policy and the differential treatment of the big manufacturers and the small-time users and even small-time sellers, it's the reason we have such, one of the job opportunities we have is working in the prison system, which is by far the biggest in the world, even compared to nations like China that we don't exactly see as free societies. Now, we only have about 10 minutes left, and there are a few events going on over this weekend that we wanted to talk about. So let's let people know what's happening. And you can, I printed out a little bit. Not much is happening in New London, I don't think, but in Greenwich and New York City, there are going to be some events. And can you tell us a little about them?
On Saturday, April 14th, in Greenwich, there's going to be a demonstration at 11 a.m. in the morning, and it is to stop wars and invest in peace. And it's aimed at the hedge funds that are congregated in Southwest Connecticut and the Gold Coast area. And hedge funds, one of the largest is owned by Ray Dalio, a man who has personal wealth of $15 billion and runs a hedge fund. I can't
even imagine that.
The largest in the world, and it's worth $180 billion. And so that what role they play is going to be given attention at this rally. And I am going, of course, and I urge other people to go as well. And on Sunday, the following day, April 15th, there is going to be a march in New York City, which is part of a nationwide series of marches. New York, Chicago, Minneapolis, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and some other cities, Boston, and they take place on Saturday and or Sunday. And the New York City March, people are going to be leaving on the Metro North from New Haven. A bus is leaving Yukon, and also the rest of us, probably most of us are not driving, but going to New Haven, taking Metro North south into New York City. And that cost is $25 plus a handling fee of $4.50 that the Metro North charges. And so that you can come with us and meet. We're going to leave. We are congregating at 10 o'clock. The bus leaves. The train leaves about 10:45, and then we are coming back from New York City at 7 p.m. And back to New Haven.
Now, can people are people buying tickets together, or is everyone just going through Metro North? Getting their tickets online.
Right. How does you can go to Hope Out Loud, hopeoutloud.org, and you can sign up for tickets there, but you can also purchase them at the train itself.
Oh, okay, and I assume they'll have lots of cars. I remember, I think it was 2001 or 2, riding the Peace Train from New Haven into New York City for a big demonstration, and it was quite the experience.
Yes, I hope.
It was a lot of fun. Especially
people with children, that they would consider bringing the whole family, because I think this is an important event. Oh, we will be meeting at a park, a plaza in New York City at 2 p.m., and then we'll be marching to Trump Tower.
So that, and then I just found this other thing. I don't know if you had seen it or not, but on April 17th, which is this year's tax day, the War Resisters League is also having an event in New York City.
Okay, good.
So, and as you know, War Resisters League is an organization that really has, over the decades, calculated the true cost of our war machine. We have a good presence of War Resisters League in Eastern Connecticut.
Yes. And they have calculated that it's not $700 billion, but double that amount when you add in interest charges for past wars and how the federal government hides military expenditures. Pensions are in the Treasury Department budget, etc., as well as secret components that no one knows about in the budget.
And you know, if you look back at the long-term cost of the wars, I mean, we are still paying for the care of Vietnam veterans and probably Korean conflict veterans and maybe a couple of World War II vets. So these are expenses that really we carry with us for a very long time. And I'm not saying we shouldn't care for our vets, we should, but before we plunge in, we need to know that it's not an investment that's over in a month or a year or a couple of years.
And that's why the estimates are that the Iraq and Afghan wars have already cost the United States as much as $3 trillion and going toward $4 trillion, because it is, the head injuries, the traumas, and 60 Minutes had a recent show how it is similar to the concussion injuries of football, but different, and has more lasting implications. And it continues. The blasts have such a harmful effect on the human brain.
Okay, we have 2 more minutes left, and so I don't know. How do you want to use it? The last couple minutes.
I'd like to talk about hopeful signs. The West Virginia teachers, to me, are one of the most hopeful signs, that they risked so much and have gone out on strike when everyone acknowledges that strikes are no more. They're not possible. And yet they did this. And in Oklahoma, they saw the example of West Virginia, and now they're copying it. They're in their 5th day of a strike. And today I saw where 120 legal workers, lawyers, women lawyers, are marching 1 mile within Oklahoma City from law offices to the state capitol and offering to be facilitators and negotiators in trying to settle this thing. They have children in the school system, and they want a better education, because in Oklahoma, they're on 4-day weeks because they have no money to pay. Wow. And they're a situation where their depletion allowance is only 2.5%. That is, in West Virginia, it's 5%, it's 2.5%. Wow. And they won't change that because the legislature is controlled by the fossil fuel industry.
So there is hope. We can take power. So we're on our last few seconds. If people want more information about the State Green Party, we have a website, ctgreenparty.org. There are a lot of different Facebook presences. And do you have any other contact info you want to give out?
No, not at this point. I would like to just mention that I am studying history because it it helps to answer questions. And one of the areas I'm studying right now is 1946. There were 7 strikes, general strikes across the U.S. in 1946 as the workers came back from the war and had worked very hard, and civilian employees worked very hard, and they expected then to now have civilian goods and increases in pay. And the corporations said no and fought that. And there were 2 general strikes I learned this weekend, one in Stamford and one in Hartford. In 1946, never knew it. I'm going to do more research on this. But this, as Harry Truman said, the most important history is the history you don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you very much. It was very, very comfortable and a good intellectual experience. Thank you.
Yeah, glad you enjoyed it.